Hello YouTubers. Today I'm going to talk to you about how to integrate OData with Cosmos DB application in an ASP.NET Core API. There are three different methods that could allow you to do such a thing, especially with Cosmos DB. But before I get deeper into that, for those of you who don't understand or don't know what Cosmos DB is, it's basically a new storage technology. It's a NoSQL based technology that supports multiple APIs, including SQL and OData and Graph and other APIs that developers and data scientists might use to store data and process data and analyze data and such. Cosmos DB is very, very famous and it's very strong. It's a planet size storage, meaning that it can support, it has this ability to, a geo redundancy feature that allows you to geo-replicate and have multiple copies of your database all around the world, especially with Microsoft Azure. We have now today more data centers than any other cloud provider in the entire world. So with something like Cosmos DB, the throughput, the speed of the database, the ability to process data that fast is definitely something you may need in particular applications. And before I dive deep into integrating with OData, I want you to understand something like data. When it comes to processing data, data comes in three different categories. There's hot data, warm data, and cold data. And this categorization of your data through the business need is definitely what dictates what kind of technology you want to use to support your storage. Let me explain that to you real quick. Hot data is data that comes in and you want to store it, but you want to serve it right away to the customer. So you need some real high speed, really fast, really powerful storage technology like Cosmos DB to support that kind of functionality. Warm data is data that comes in, you process it first, and then you push it back to the customer. So the customer knows that there's some processing involved. They don't want it immediately. They want it after it being processed. You could use a SQL database with that. You could continue to use Cosmos with that. It depends on what kind of, how much processing versus how much time, what's the SLA, the expectation that you want your customer to wait before they get an email to say, hey, your data has been processed. The third type is the cold data, data that's only being served based on demand, and the speed here is not really a problem. So you could use anything out there like Glacier or Blobs, Azure Blobs, or any other technology that doesn't necessarily have to put you in the cost of supporting a high speed, high throughput data processing. So with that being in mind, let's talk about Cosmos DB, ASP.NET APIs, and then OData on top of that. How do we get all these three technologies the simplest and the fastest way possible to get this done? There are, like I said, there are three ways you could get OData with Cosmos DB and ASP.NET API. The first one we're going to talk about today is the easiest of them all. I'm going to go ahead in here and I'm going to create, here's my Azure Portal. I'm going to create a new resource group and I'm going to call it Cosmos with OData resources. Let's create that. When you're creating a cloud resources, it's really good to separate your resources into different resource groups, so you are able, if you want to get rid of all of them, you can just get rid of all of them at once. So let me share the screen here real quick. I forgot to share the screen. So here's, I created a Cosmos with OData resources in here. And then I'm going to go in here and create a Cosmos DB, Azure Cosmos DB. All right, here's Azure Cosmos DB. And then as you can see here, there's that API. And in the APIs, you have all different kinds of APIs that you can use. There's Graph, which is really, really good when it comes to geospatial data processing needs. You have Azure Table. I'm going to share a link with you in the description of this video. And Azure Tables allows you, without having to build an API, to immediately go ahead and use OData immediately full CRUD operations with the database. So you don't have to build an API in front of it to deal with that. It comes in useful when you just want to do CRUD operations, but of course if you want to add OData on top of your existing API, you want to integrate and add in, a middle layer to do some processing. And then there's Cassandra, Azure CosmosDB, and all others. For this particular demo, I'm going to use Core SQL. And then I'm going to call this students DB. I hope that's not taken. Let's see, students DB. All right, account name is students DB. And then we're going to create this database. Create. All right, so while it's being created, it takes a little bit of time. Let's go ahead in here and create a new ASP.NET web API. So ASP.NET Core Application, Cosmos with OData demo. Let's create that. And here's an API. I'm using ASP.NET Core 2.2, and I'm just going to create my API here real quick. Let me rebuild my solution. All right. The first thing I want to do, so one of the options, that's not the fast options, but one of the options is to build, to use an entity framework table, an entity framework NuGet package to interact with Cosmos, and then everything else is exactly the same way with OData. So let's see how that works. Let's first interact. So let's go ahead in here and build, search for NuGet packages. Let's search for entity framework and Cosmos. Here you have Microsoft.entityframeworkcore.cosmos, and there are a bunch of previews in here, but since we're using 2.2, we're going to pick up the 2.2 one and just install it. There's installation. I accept. All right, so now we accept it. Now we want to instantiate that. When I build my APIs, I like to break them down into brokers and services and controllers. But since there's no particular business logic in here, I'm just going to have the controllers talk directly to the controllers. In the brokers area, I'm just going to create a class in here. I'm going to call it students DB context. And this guy, just like any entity framework class, here's a constructor. You can get a constructor by just type in ctor and tap twice, and then you can say DB context options, students DB context, and then you have options, and then we're passing these options down to the base class, right? All right, there we go. Now the second thing we want to build, there's this new folder I like to create just to encapsulate all the models. And because our model here is just students, we're just going to create a new class, and we're going to call it student. And our new student class is going to have an ID. It's going to have a name. It's going to have a score. I guess we can simplify string in here with the alias. We can make it lowercase string, and everything is good. All right, you have the student model, and now, just like any entity framework example, we could do a DP set and then put in student model, and now we have students. All of this is just exactly like any SQL database. There's no difference here whatsoever. Now, here comes the tricky part, the setup part. If you go in here in the services area, you're not going here and say services and then add a singleton. I think add DB context. Add DB context, and then we have students DB context. Let's get that in here. There you go. And then out of that, here's a tricky part. You can go and say options dot use Cosmos. Use Cosmos like this. Control period. Here's Cosmos. Right? And inside of that, you just want to fill in a bunch of things. And I'm going to show you now where you can get those from. So the first thing you want to do, we want the endpoint, the service endpoint. I'm going to leave that empty for now. And you want the auth. And you want the name of the table name or the database name. There it is. The database name is basically what we just created. These are the options that we need to pass in. Now, where do we get these things from? Let's go back here. And hopefully the resource, great. So the resource is created. So let's go back to our Cosmos with OData resource. We have students DP. If you go into the keys area, you have all that information that you need. So I'm going to copy that in here. Just that's the endpoint. That's our endpoint right here. And then the second thing I want to copy is the primary key. And then the last thing is the database name, which is, this is a very important one. I had to do a little bit of research just to understand this one. This is literally the database that you have, which is students DP. So let's go ahead and create that. DP, like that. Right? So all of that, now we hooked up your ASP.NET Core API with Cosmos. But we're not done here yet. Let's go ahead and test this by adding a bunch of students, right? So I'm gonna go in here and say, just for any controller, let me create a controller here real quick. Controller, and beautifully, Visual Studio will give you this ability to just create an API within different, it'll just generate the entire CRUD operations for you, just like that. So as soon as you click that, it'll just generate the entire thing for you. You don't have to write one line of code here. Let's give that a second. All right, so everything is generated. So here's what I'm gonna do. When I say get students, I'm gonna do something here just for one time, which is I'm gonna go and say await context and then database, and then ensure database created async. So we want to make sure that there's a database created for students. And then the next thing I'm going to do here is just create a bunch of students. So I'm just going to go here and say students.add, and then I'm just going to create a new student just on the fly real quick for this case. So here's a student, just give them an ID, GUID.new GUID, give it a name, here's a name, and then give them a score like this. Right? Let's create another one just for the purpose of this demo. So let's create another one in here real quick. Let's call it Birdo. Let's give it 120. Right? And then the last thing we want to do, just like any CRUD operations, you want to say save changes async, and then you're going to list these students. So let's do await. So the first time we're just running this just to add a bunch of students. I'm going to remove that code. This is very temporary code, so don't worry about that. Now let's test and see if our stuff is working. So let's go ahead in here and run our application. So our hypothesis here is that when I hit /students endpoint, what's going to happen, it's going to ensure the database is created, and then it's going to add a bunch of students, and then it's going to list these students for me, and then we're going to get rid of those couple of lines. So I can say /API/students. Let's see if that'll work with us. There you go. So it created a bunch of students. which means if I go back here in Cosmos and refresh this guy, or just get out of the Data Explorer and just refresh this guy for a second. So you see it has a students database, and then it has students DB context, and inside that students DB context you see the students that I added in my Cosmos database. There it is. I had Robert and I have Hassan. All right, so now that we got this out of the way, let's go ahead and remove these lines, and let's add in OData to our system. So now you have OData running on your existing Cosmos DB. So what do I need? Just like the previous videos that I made, I'm going to go in here and say manage NuGet packages, and then I'm going to say OData. I need OData core. So Microsoft ASP.NET Core OData. Let me install that real quick. You're going to do that really fast so you can see the capabilities here. All right, so this is done. And then in the startup area, I'm just going to go in here and say services, add OData, like this. And then at the bottom here, we're going to say route builder, like this, and then route builder dot enable dependency injection, and route builder dot select filter, and all that kind of good stuff, right? You can add in however much you want. Now the last thing we want to do with this is in the students controller, we want to add in enable query. All right, there you go. So enabled query. Now we have an API that talks to Cosmos, and then we added on top of that API, we added OData. Let's see if that works for us. It's loading. All right, so if I do /students, let's just make sure that our existing functionality is working. So that's students. And then on top of that, if I go and say question mark $, and then select equal name, it should give me just the names for these students coming out of Cosmos DB. So just the names of these students coming out of that, which means if I want the name and the score only, it should just give me the score. And if I want to filter and filter equal score greater than 100, it should return only Roberto. And that's what it is. So that's the first way to integrate both Cosmos to ASP.NET Core API and then call that in your API. That's one way to do it. Now, I've always told people you don't really need the entity framework to work with your OData, right? So here's the other option for you. There is this way when you in your Cosmos DB, you could go in here and you could go to the quick start area, and in the .NET Core area it says create items container. So it'll create items container, create a sample database for you to try things out. So creating container, and then you can download an ASP, a .NET Core application that will eventually, so let's go ahead, just open that one up. So it basically built an entire application for you that you can use on top of your existing API. So let me unzip that real quick first. Let me close that. Let me go to my downloads, extract all. So here's my ASP.NET Core application. I'm just going to run that real quick. So what this guy basically done is that it created a solution for you, a pre-made solution. Without, I didn't write one line of code here. It created a pre-made solution for you that allows you to interact with a sample database that's called to-do list. So you have to-do list, you have items, and in that items area there's nothing yet, right? But it gave you a solution to work with that. So let's run that solution and see what happens. Unable to launch, blah, blah, blah. Something else is using my server. And a lot of things running. Let's try that again. Let me shut down my ISS server here. And then let's start that again. Or we could change the port. So you can, so that's a good idea. So if you go to the launch area in here, you could change that port like to whatever port you want. So I'm just going to choose this one. You can actually change your application URL. I think that's the one. You can change your application URL to whatever you want. So let's do that. So the solution that it generated for you here, Azure Portal, is basically, what it basically does is that it gives you it builds an ASP.NET MVC application that allows you to create, delete, like I can go here and say wash your teeth. And then don't forget to wash your teeth. Right? If you create that and it's not completed, what's happening, see, it's full CRUD operation. You could edit that, you could remove, like people who are familiar with ASP.NET MVC are very familiar with this pattern with the bootstrap. But the interesting part here, if you go back here and load more in this guy, let's refresh this list. Now it will show me the brush your teeth task that I just created. I didn't write one line of code here. I just downloaded the sample, right? Which means you can actually leverage that by just changing what collection are you targeting when it comes to building a full MVC MVC CRUD operations in Azure Document DB with ASP.NET Core. So okay, so that's the out of the box part. I want to turn that into an API without having to write, without having to use Entity Framework. So in the controllers area here, I could go in here and say, build me a new controller. And in this new controller, just build me an API with read-write actions. So I'm just going to create that, and I'm going to call it items controller. It will just create a sample scaffold, sample application, sample controller to help you build a better API without all that boilerplate stuff. So here's my items controller. Now, if you look at the sample that was generated for us, look, it generated something called document DB repository, which is the repository pattern that comes in already pre-configured to target particular collections and particular database and all that kind of stuff. You can play around with that and change the model however you want. What matters to us here, though, is that this get items async part, right? Get items async part. So what we're going to do, we're going to steal the creating a new client from this controller here. This guy is using the document repository client. So we're just going to steal that part. And we're going to put it here in our API controller in the constructor area. And we have just few references to fix, a control period. There you go. Everything is good. And then in the repository area, we're just going to go back and say, for this items controller, I'm going to steal that one as well. The await repository, get items async. I'm going to go back here. Instead of returning a bunch of values, I'm going to return a bunch of items, which means that I am returning a type item. I'm not returning a string anymore. And this method is async, and it takes a task because it's awaitable. There you go. Here's my API. Now let's verify that this API is actually working the way I expect. Just you know, upkeep. I'm just going to remove that stuff, that existing full qualified reference to the repository. So now I have an API, I have all that stuff. Let's run that and see if our API is actually working. Our hypothesis is that when we call the API, it's going to return back the to-do items that we created just a second ago. So let's do that. Give it a second there. All right, so that means if I hit /API/items, it should come back and give me that item, right? Just for testing purposes, I'm going to create another one and say, I don't know, put gas in your car. Don't forget to put gas in the car. So I'm creating two in here. I'm going to go back /API/items. And here is the full CRUD operation. Sorry, here's the entire list of things that I've created. All right, now we want to add OData to this. You already guessed it. I'm just gonna, do exactly the same thing that I did a second ago. Go back in here, NoGate packages, browse, OData. You have ASP.NET Core OData. There you go. Just gonna add that real quick. All right, and then the exact same thing. You have services. Everything here is already configured for you. Just want to add in if I know how to spell, services.add OData. There you go. And then at the bottom here, we want to use those routes to enable dependency injection. And then routes again to enable select, filter, and everything else, whatever you want to do, right? Now, the last thing I want to do is just on top of my endpoint, I want to say enable query, just like that. All right, when you enable query, now all we have to do is to just run in here and test and see if OData is working with CosmosDB without Entity Framework. It doesn't really matter. The repository pattern in this particular case isn't really using anything other than an existing client and API calls and such, and it's already all generated and pre-built for you from scratch. So all right, so we have our endpoint in here, so /API/items. Let's make sure everything is working. And then here's OData. So I do question mark, select name, and it's returning just the name. So that's it. The second method that you can use to interact with CosmosDB and add OData on top of it without using Entity Framework. So we demonstrate the Entity Framework, without the Entity Framework, and the third one is without any coding at all, which is the big one. This is, I'm not going to go through the details. I'm just going to reference the documentation here because it's pretty straightforward. You have Azure CosmosDB, and if you go in the create area in here, you have this option here called Azure Table, right? If you go to Azure CosmosDB OData, you're going to find in here that the Azure CosmosDB table API supports OData and link, right? And then it creates, this is a full example for you that shows you, like, you could do the endpoint and then filter where partial key equals blah, blah, blah. You could do all the things that you want to do interacting directly with an API. Now, I'm going to have to be honest with you, the authentication from Cosmos, because I know a lot of people will want to use this with Cosmos. Sorry, the authentication with Postman is a little bit tricky. So I highly recommend, you could use develop with a table API in .NET. If you go in here, it'll show you full examples all the way down to the coding level, how to run queries and how to take advantage of all that good stuff that OData is living on top, is using on top of your existing Cosmos database without you having to write any code at all. You just create the Cosmos DB and add in the data, and everything else will just work for you. So it's very, very important, to take a look at that, see how you're going to query the data, all that kind of good stuff. So that's pretty much it. Cosmos DB, you have to be to understand like when you want to use Cosmos DB, how important it is, and you know how to employ it. Like, do not just run after every shiny thing or shiny technology you find. See if it actually fits the business model that you're working with. The whole purpose of these videos that I'm making for people is just to show them what's out there and show them the options, and allow them, like a good technologist and an architect is a person that learns about all the possible technologies out there and then makes the best decision based on the business that they're working with. So that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out. I am on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, LinkedIn, even Instagram, and definitely here on YouTube. Feel free to post any questions, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in another video. Thank you for watching.